This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 75. Does competition hold us back?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, is competition a benefit or a hindrance? We're told competition is key to the functioning of an efficient economy because nobody gets away with behaviour that would be detrimental to the greater good. But what if the greater good is being missed out on because companies are too busy competing on things like price rather than working together on innovative solutions that they'll never be able to reach on their own? What if competition actually gets in the way of advancing society? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Now, Eve Poole, in her book Capitalism's Toxic Assumption, suggests competition is more destructive than positive. In truth, success and growth comes from collaboration, she says, and our reliance on competition has historically been driven by too much testosterone. But how can you develop a system where cooperation is effectively rewarded? So, Steve, first of all, this is a book, and this is an economics book, which I have read, and you haven't. I didn't know such a book existed, but it's a good it's a good book. So, and now I've told you this, you've been on Amazon and you've ordered the bloody thing, so that's good. I
have. So I'll see if I can read it while I'm flying back to Australia at Christmas time or something like that.
Now, look, let's start with an example of competition gone wrong. Because I know you think a good model of competition, because we've spoken about this in the past, is a situation where you've got one dominant player in the market, but you've got lots of almost, smaller companies, mid-sized companies who are competing, and they're the ones that are adding innovation. So that innovation is challenging the big company, so it can't get too big for its boots. But, sometimes strength can be destructive, can't it? So let's, and I want to give you an example on this, on an area I know and understand. I mean, just imagine there's a big Australian phone company. I mean, we won't, let's not name names. Let's create a fictional name. So we'll call it Ostra. And they build a new mobile base station in a small country town. And everybody in that town now has access to a mobile phone, which they didn't before, but they've got to buy it from Ostra. And nobody else is going to want to build there, because if they build a mobile phone tower, it's going to cost too much and they're going to divide the market, and it's not going to justify the expense of building another tower. So in theory, Ostra would say, well, it's competition. You're welcome to, but we're using our market power to extend our network as far as possible, and we are claiming 100% market share. That's not really competition, though, is it?
Yeah, that's the reality. This is the unfortunate thing, that we have this vision that the neoclassical theory has an effective vision of costless entry and exit from markets. So you can simply decide to go into a market and pull out again later. And of course, that simply is totally fictional, because if you're going to compete with Ostra in that country town, let's call it Gulagenbahn, then you need to put a second tower in presence. And having put that second tower in, you've got a sunk cost you can't get back again. And you divide the market in two, so you make going from one profitable company to two failing companies. One then pulls out again later, and you have a huge amount of waste generated out of that to no positive benefit.
And the competition regulator is never going to say anything about that, because they're going to say, well, look, if we said something, Ostra wouldn't have built in that town and we'd all be worse off. But of course, if you look at collaboration, I mean, if Ostra would allow other providers to use their tower, then you would have competition. Or if Ostra and all the other providers said, well, actually, there's a whole load of areas which we can't get to because it's just not, it's too expensive for us to do it. But let's all, collaborate. You'd extend the footprint of the mobile network, and everyone would win.
That's right. So you need a mixture of both competition and cooperation, and this is what mainstream economics is incapable of capturing properly, because it makes simplifying assumptions like there can be costless entry and exit from a market. So what's your problem? I'm sorry, my problem is outside your assumptions. So that's the real dilemma. So again, the ideal situation in a telecommunications example would be to have either a nationally owned, a government-owned institution that provides the physical backbone, or you tell the companies, they've got to form a consortium that lays out the hardware, and then they can compete over the software.
Yeah, or they just do it themselves. And I think this is part of, Eve Poole's point in this book. Very often, our company's going to be better off if they collude. Forget about making it the law. If the companies just had the common sense, if all phone companies had gone, why I was laughing when you talked about the government owning the infrastructure, because those people not familiar with Australia, I mean, the government set about building the national broadband network, and by all accounts, the whole thing's ended up as an expensive disaster through various reasons. But if all phone companies had colluded and said, well, look, we need to build this national broadband network, and we'll all get a share of the revenue that's probably not there now, plus we have the opportunity to develop, benefit from new services that are going to run on it, and that's where we can all create our competitive difference. If there had been adults in the room with the good sense to realize that, rather than one of them saying, well, no, we own, the vast majority of telecommunications in this country, and we're just going to make it difficult for everybody else. If there'd been that sense of collusion, then the country would be better off, the industry would be better off, and people would be spending more on telecommunications if that had been common sense adopted at the time.
Spending less than they're spending right now to get a higher quality service. That's the real dilemma.
Yeah, but they'd also be buying other stuff as well. There'd be opportunities for you just look in this country, in the UK, and then it's unheard of that you wouldn't be running TV over the internet and buying services. Whereas in Australia, it's still a bit unique, I think, because the broadband's not up to it.
That's right, and Australia's actually in many ways it's a classic case of getting an obsession with competition, screwing everything up. Yeah. Not just the government side of things, where let's name names. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull was given the job of shafting the NBN by Tony Abbott to undermine was it the Rudd government at the time, or the Gillard? I lose track, and so they forced changes on the network when they took over that made it unworkable. And the whole thing is a complete mess. But a large part of it was the belief that there should be competition at every level rather than occasions collusion. And the collusion can be something which gives you a base technology that lowers the cost for everybody, and it becomes effectively it's a common resource. And in that situation, collusion, getting together and cooperating, is far more effective, and with economic theory makes it impossible for people to understand that there can be a balance between collusion and cooperation.
Well, yeah, and Eve Poole in this book does make this point very well, and she says part of the problem is men. Because men are, the focus in men, the testosterone in our system has this whole fight or flight thing. And so we see business as a competition that they must win. It's a zero-sum game. So the aim is to knock out the competition. Rather than focusing on creating anything new, you put a man into a senior position, and the first thing you'll do is say, well, okay, who's the competition? How can we knock them down to size, so that they either cease to exist or so we can buy them? It's the gains are always at the expense of your competitor, rather than saying, well, competitors are there, but how do we grow our business? And that's very much a male thing, isn't it? How do I knock the competition?
It's also an Asperger's autistic thing, and frankly, and I've seen it, enough women getting to positions of power have got the same characteristics. Right. Basically, there's something about a structure that encourages sociopaths to get to the top. So I'd say testosterone is definitely a role, but so's a form of Asperger's getting in the way as well, and just not even seeing the social structure you're trying to promote. So I take the point of the testosterone point. I saw enough of that at the INET conference myself a couple of days ago, in terms of how that was designed. But it comes down also to just having a dysfunctional personalities is a positive advantage in getting to the top of large organizations, and also the academic world. Yeah. But fundamentally, we haven't understood there can be a balance between cooperation and competition. And ecosystems show us this is quite remarkable. George Monbiot was involved in a documentary recently to look at what was the impact of bringing back wolves into, I think it was the Yellowstone National Park in America. And before that was done, the dominant animal in Yellowstone were the deer, or they would be deer, elks.
Not sure.
They were the top prey, effectively, but there's no predator above them. When they brought the wolves back in, what the wolves did was to mean that they drove let's call them elks, away from the open plains into the forested regions. There was therefore less eating of trees tree plantings that fell in the grassed areas, therefore more trees developed, the level of forests increased. That gave beavers a chance to come back into the system, and the entire ecosystem improved in what you might imagine as a cooperative sense because of the introduction of a competitive element, which was a chief predator that had been removed earlier. So in other words, we have a very evolutionary complex web where sometimes what one species does assists what another species can do as well. And the same thing applies in the economy. But because we have this totally competitive oriented vision, then it's competition, and collusion must be banned. And a lot of government policy is based on economic theory that says we should prevent firms getting together and colluding. And that partly sets up the mindset that leads to this testosterone type factor we're talking about in the first place.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, that makes a good point about maintaining some sort of ecosystem, isn't it? And Eve Poole in this book, which I've read and you haven't. Just thought I'd get that in again. She compares it competition with sport. So in sport, you play a game, but you want the competition to survive because, next Saturday, you've got to have someone else to play against. And because you've got those competitors surviving, you have to get better and they have to get better. So everybody wins. Whereas in business, we do the opposite. We tend to destroy the competition, destroy the league as well until we're left on our own and we don't have to worry about getting better.
And there's also another element of that, which is quite a simple practical one. If you're working in industry, you don't want, like a car industry, you don't want one car to have the driving wheel on the left side and the other on the right. You want to have the brake pedal on the, on the same side, no matter which car you get into. But if you, and that comes out of cooperation. So, for example, the most recent was USB-C, the latest form of USB port. Which is, it doesn't matter which way you put it in, whichever way you put it in, it goes in the right way. It can be used for power as well as signals, and you can use it for video as well as for sound, as well as for data transfer. Now, that took a committee of people from different firms getting together to say, here's our jointly agreed standard. So we're all going to produce exactly the same interface. So ultimately, rather than having, one plug for your Samsung device, another plug for your Apple device, yada, 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 you'll have one simple standard. So consumers actually benefit out of that level of collaboration by firms.
But how do you control it? That's the thing. And where do you draw the line? Because, regulators, the law in the UK basically says anything that prevents or distorts competition is prohibited. Or, preventing competition, maybe, but distorting competition, as we've just discussed, might actually be, it depends on your interpretation of it. It's a fairly broad approach, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is, you simply have to take an intelligent approach of saying, what is the effect of making competitive rollout of something versus cooperative rollout? So the telecommunication cards has always been one of the classic examples, because if you have in a Glargambone gets one tower owned by one distributor, you get an effective local monopoly. Now, part of the theory is saying we need competition. But if you require the competition, you've got to put another tower in there. The market's not big enough to support the two towers, so the system collapses, and you only get the one. So if you actually want competition there, what you have to have is say, what blend do we do of the rollout to make a cooperative level that means there's lots of competition? And this is they can't cope with irony. Cooperation can lead to competition. So if you had a single tower being erected, owned by God knows what, whether it's a consortium or it's a government owned and so on, and then multiple service providers being able to use that to broadcast and providing different cost structures and different incentives, different services over it, then you get a very competitive market in little old Glargambone, and it might become a technological hub. But at the moment, it's a backwater because there's only monopoly. It charges what it likes, and you therefore have restricted creative side of people's use of that technology.
Well, isn't it curious in that situation that somebody else wouldn't come along and knock on the council's door? I guess it's all in the timing, isn't it? And say, look, you'll probably get an approach from Austria saying they want to build a tower here. Why don't you let us build a tower? We're a separate tower building company and we sell to everybody. So if you allow us to build the tower, we'll go to every telco and say, look, do you want to be on it? And then you'll have competition in your town. It's strange that didn't happen.
Well, then that's where the testosterone really does come in, because the old boys network gets in the way. It all goes to Telstra, and there's a bit of a back deal you and I don't see that ensures that competitive provider doesn't get off the ground. So,
So back on that testosterone thing. Yeah, I mean, you're probably right. That's exactly what happened, which is distorting probably what you would expect to happen if we're working in a vacuum. But Eve Poole's point is that women are much more focused on tend and befriend rather than fight or flight. So more women on boards, she reckons, does build a more collaborative approach with competitors. And so getting more women out there is part of the answer.
I can see a possibility of that, but what the point which is being missed in the way conventional theory thinks about it was actually very well covered by one of the very, very simple but very great little models in economics by a guy called Hertz-Telling, and he said, normally we argue competition is best and you shouldn't have any market controls that'll make the system work less well. But he said, imagine an ice cream seller on a beach where the customers on the beach are uniformly distributed. So you've got something like, Manly Beach in Sydney, or you've got, the main beach in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires in Rio de Janeiro. The best place for the ice cream seller, if there's one, is right in the middle of the beach. So if you say the beach is 2 kilometres long, the maximum you've got to walk is 1 kilometre. If you have a second competitor, the best position for the society as a whole is that person locates at the 1 2/3 of a kilometre mark, and the other one moves to the 1 2/3 mark, effectively 1 and 1.
Yeah,
I've got my maths mixed up, but going to the 1/3, 2/3 position.
Yeah.
Now, in fact, what happens is if they actually suggested, let's say it's a kilometre long beach, your best situation is one provider in the middle. There's only one provider, so for the 500 metre mark. But if you then have a second one, you'd want one at 300 metres and the other at 660 metres.
Yeah.
And everybody walks, again, it reduces the distance everybody has to work from maximum half a kilometre to maximum, effectively 1/6 of a kilometre. But if one of those then moves right next to its competitor, so you have them both located at the 2/3 of a kilometre mark, then the one at the 2/3 of a kilometre mark gets half the market above them and all of the market below, and that is socially undesirable. So what happens is competitive pressures will mean all the ice cream sellers locate at the middle of the beach, and everybody has to walk up to half a kilometre to get to their ice cream.
Yeah.
So you're with regulation saying, no, a second competitor, first one has to move to the 300 metre mark, the second goes to the 700 metre mark, and therefore we're benefiting the consumers. They walk a lower distance, and we're likely to sell more ice creams. Now, that's exactly the analogy you're talking about. And there's a good fundamentally mathematical model of that, which says in that case we should have collaboration between them, or a regulatory decision as to where they locate, and that benefits the consumers. And this simple piece of wisdom is blocked by the supply and demand thinking that still dominates economics.
Yeah, or it gets interpreted by the regulator, and the regulator gets it wrong.
Yeah, which is the other possibility. I mean, but the trouble is regulators are often getting it wrong by enforcing competitions. Let's go back to that strange little country you called Australia earlier. You and I would, maybe you're not a resident then, but in the 80s, of course, they decided to have optical fibre. This is before we had the internet. Optical fibre for cable TV.
Yeah.
And they mandated that there should be 2 competitive rollouts of the cable. Telstra is one company. Astra was one company, and the other was Optus. And they were both in the street I was in, both dug up the street to lay optical fibre. So you had 2 sets of cables running down the one street. Yeah,
they chased each other around the cities, basically, didn't they?
But they also avoided each other in other areas where it simply wasn't profitable. So, as I know from friends at the time, Dundas was a relatively wealthy rural section in Australia, got 0 cable, because neither firm regarded as worth their while. It was just too far between houses for them to bother laying cable. So what you had was, consequently, a highly unsuccessful competitive rollout of optical fibre, and now they've topped it up with a highly unsuccessful competitive rollout, or the centralised rollout of internet backbone. with government meddling getting in the way. So, two complete first prizes for moronic behaviour by Australia, in both cases being obsessed with competition.
So it does get to the question, doesn't it, how you regulate all of this? Because you have that, that very stringent law that says, you shouldn't distort competition in any way. And the focus tends to be very often on price, doesn't it? Well, what can we control? We can make sure that you're not behaving in a predatory fashion with price. But I mean, it's... And look, I think I mentioned to you before, I've been, tell me if this is a bad thing. I've been at a cocktail party. This was back in the 80s, actually.
That's pretty bad, yeah. Sorry.
This was in Australia. And a group of sort of middle-ranking airline executives were sharing a glass of champagne each. Bottle of champagne, I should say. And they were talking about the prices that they were going to offer to Europe next summer. Mm-hmm. And sort of more or less agreed on a price there and then, that they were going to go out and sell. So, wow. But they weren't talking the price up. They were talking about how low they could go to get the maximum number of customers. So that is obviously completely illegal that conversation was going on. The only people who were going to lose out from that conversation were the airlines that weren't involved in that conversation, because they may have come out on the same day with a price that was higher and then have to quickly respond. But the consumer was getting a lower price because the whole conversation was, what can we offer? How can we make it cheaper so the market gets bigger next summer? Is that a bad thing or a good thing?
No, I think sometimes this is a good thing. And this is, again, it's often a case of saying, let's not let an economist make the decision. Let's get an engineer in there who actually work out the individual costs involved in something and say what makes sense, what's going to be produce a better service overall. And an engineer looking at telecommunication would say, in every town, you need one major tower first off, and then when the second tower is created, it's got to be based on the population distribution, not the hitting the most dense area. So with a straight competitive rollout, all the towers go over one building in the heart of the city because that's where the major money is made, and you forget about the suburbs. With the engineer saying, well, let's locate the first one in the major population centre, then further out to take the load, and we share the cost between the different providers, and they can all use these different towers. So it's an engineering approach. Economists are stuffed up so much, particularly when it comes to new technology. We should be letting engineers make the decisions about how to roll it out commercially, rather than economists and politicians.
Right, but there's so much to watch, isn't there? There's so much, so many lines of business doing so much every day. How can the regulator have the finger in all of those pies? So here's another example. Say, we've seen that a couple of newspapers have decided, interestingly, I think it was like the Mail and the Mirror, two theologically opposed newspapers. They both preach from completely different opposite ends of the spectrum, but they've decided they're going to share costs by printing at the same printing press. And imagine if they pulled in other newspapers and said, well, okay, let's all, it's a big expense producing newspapers, so let's all pool the latest technology and reduce our costs as much as possible. That's a good thing, isn't it? Until they say to one newspaper, but you're not in on this, so you're going to have to run your own printing press, and that newspaper goes out of business. Then that's a bad thing.
Yeah, you've got. You have to have that recognition in the first place. That first of all, that a huge part of reducing costs and innovation is economies of scale, and there are some technology where the economies of scale are so huge that if you two industries, two firms competing against each other, will have a higher cost structure than one firm being a monopoly. This is the whole idea of increasing returns to scale, and that certainly applies with things like telecommunications networks. And cable rail out and so on. So in that situation, you want to have multiples getting involved, but you also want to make sure they can't exclude legitimate competitors coming in and using the same facility. And that's the part where you need a certain amount of state regulation or state application to say, well, if you fulfill these criteria, which themselves are justifiable criteria, then we can't stop you joining up to that network.
But we are so far, aren't we? Wherever you look, certainly in terms of the UK and Australia, the two countries that I know well. And I've worked in the telecommunications industry, so I'm very aware of competition law. We are so far from having an effective form of regulation. I guess because the regulation is largely focused on price, because that's the easiest thing to get hold of.
Yeah,
but it's a difficult task to try and fix this because I think my point is it would be so huge, wouldn't it, to try and look at every single conversation that is being had between businesses and for somebody to be able to say, well, that looks like that's going to create a good collaborative outcome, and no, that looks like it's just a market power play.
But it does come down to the economies of scale thing. And is it something which has got such enormous economies of scale, then you do want to have a collaborative rollout of a network rather than having a competitive rollout. I mean, nobody would ever talk about, ice cream manufacturing needing to be, such huge economies of scale that you're best to share the facilities to make the ice cream and then distribute it. For a start, part of your cost is actually refrigeration and immersion. That itself means you're likely to have a distributed network of those producers rather than a central location. So there are ways to look at the actual industry structure and the nature of the technology and say, okay, that's the most effective way is a collusive, centralized, shared rollout and then competition around that infrastructure. In other cases, forget centralization, let lots of them compete.
But even if it's not an economy of scale question, even if a company says, oh well, look, this industry needs to move on to the next phase, and at the moment we are competing on whatever it is that we're doing right now, we could move off this phase and on to the next opportunity if we all just work together. So I'd like to go and knock on the door of company X and Y and get us all in a boardroom together and see how we can move together swifter. But I can't do that because the regulators will be breathing down on X because they'll see that as being collusion or collaboration, and that's prevented by law. So, this fear that the regulator is going to see something as being anti-competitive, whereas actually these companies just want to move on, is an example of the regulator slowing things down, which might be not for the public good.
Yeah, sometimes you've got to say what sort of things in terms of characteristics of industries, what ones should be regulated. And you can see them going through a life cycle, in effect, that, for example, when you first had railroads being run out, the people who were doing that were seeing incredible profit coming out of the fact of bringing in a whole new technology which replaces a previous one, which of course was carriages, horse-drawn carriages, to go from one location to another. And the profit advantage people running out the railroads would see was so extreme that, of course, they got it wrong too, frankly, a lot of them. They've just made too many. But that built the amazing railway structure we see in the UK these days. Now, any attempt to regulate that on the basis of trying to prevent competition, collusion between railroad companies would actually have failed to see that what's actually going on here is, in fact, competition between the industry called railroads and the industry called horse-drawn carriages.
Yeah.
And there's in that situation, you actually want that creative destruction to occur. And you have to leave that possibility of enormous profit to be perceived by entrepreneurs in the first place for them to invent something like railroads. And I've seen this, my favorite, most recent example of that is Elon Musk's idea that he could use the BFR to not for just getting to Mars, but for replacing intercontinental travel on Earth, which taking, say, 12 hours to fly between continents with jets, with 20 minutes to fly between them with rockets. And in that case, if Musk is going to do it, he's got to make an absolute fortune out of the rockets, and good luck to him, because that potential for profit is a huge inspiration to get the technology to work. If you tried to regulate at that stage and said, no, we can't let you have this rocket line until, what's his name, Bozo catches up and Branson catch up with their technology, we'd stymie the industry before it gets the chance to develop. So you need an evolutionary understanding of all this and an engineering understanding, and unfortunately we have an economic one.
Yeah. And we have a testosterone charged one as well. So, Eve Poole's suggestion at the end of the chapter is that, companies do need to collaborate. It needs to be, we need to get rid of this destructive testosterone-based approach. We need more tend and befriend rather than fight or flight. And whether it's men or it's just the attitude of the people we're putting at the top of those jobs, we need people who have this more collaborative, focused approach. And to get over the regulator issue, we should encourage this collaboration. We just need to document it somehow. We just need some way of saying, well, okay, these meetings are being held. The regulator can't keep an eye on all of it, but there needs to be sort of, almost records kept to show, look, we discussed this because we believed it was in the public good. This is what we're going on and doing. And if it creates problems down the track, then I guess you've got a bit of a paper trail. I think that's in effect what she's saying. But, let's not stop collaboration because of the regulation. Let's get the right people in the jobs. And let's change this focus on competition is not about destroying other companies.
Yep, I think that sounds quite reasonable. I better read the book, hadn't I?
Better go and read the book, exactly. Yeah. All right. Talk to you again soon, Steve.
Okay, mate, bye.
Now, next time, the productivity problem around the world. Productivity growth has disappeared. In fact, in the UK, from the first to the second quarter of 2017, productivity actually fell. So what's going wrong and how big a problem is it? That's next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. I'll see you then.